The transmission came in at 03:12 hours, and I was already awake. I had not slept in 2 days. Not because I was afraid, though I was. Not because I was excited, though I was that too. I was awake because 37 pages of Galactic Council legal language were spread across my desk, and somewhere inside those 37 pages was the sentence that changed everything for 8 billion people. I had found it on page 19, buried between two clauses about orbital sovereignty and resource taxation. It read, in the cool, bloodless language of interstellar bureaucracy, the vessel designated UES Unbowed is to be decommissioned, disassembled, and its component materials surrendered to Council custody within 30 standard solar cycles, or the signatory world known as Earth will face full economic and diplomatic severance from the Interstellar Trade Compact. That was it. That was the whole thing. 30 years of human engineering, 4,000 lives stationed aboard, and the single most advanced spacecraft humanity had ever built, reduced to a line item on a compliance notice. My name is Yael Dresch. I am 34 years old. I was born in a small coastal city, and I spent most of my childhood reading books about space, because the sky above my house was always cloudy, and I figured the only way to see the stars properly was to go up and meet them. I have a master's degree in xenolinguistics and a second one in interstellar political theory, and I had been working in Earth's diplomatic liaison office for 6 years before someone decided I was the right person to put on a warship and send to the edge of known space. I want to be honest about something right from the start. I was not a soldier. I had never been a soldier. I did not want to be one. What I wanted, more than anything in the world, was to talk. I believed, genuinely and deeply, that talking was the most powerful thing a person could do. I had watched diplomats end border disputes with the right sentence, spoken at the right moment. I had watched two alien species who had been in a resource conflict for a century reach a trade agreement because someone finally explained to one of them that the other one communicated grief through silence rather than words, and they had been misreading each other's silence as arrogance for 100 years. That kind of thing thrilled me. That was the work I wanted to do. So it said something about the state of the galaxy that I was standing in a briefing room in Geneva at 3 in the morning, looking at a holographic image of a ship the size of a small city, being told that I would be going aboard it as the sole diplomatic representative of the human race. The briefing officer was a man named Colonel Grant Daly. He was the kind of person who looked like he had been born in a uniform, tall and deliberate, with a face that had spent a lot of time in difficult weather. He had the patience of someone who had delivered bad news before and knew that the best way to do it was slowly and clearly with no softening at the edges. He pulled up the image of the Unbowed on the main screen and let me look at it for a moment before he said anything. The ship was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. It was dark gray and long, built in a way that reminded you of a blade, not because it was thin, but because every surface of it looked deliberate, functional, intentional. There were no decorative elements. There were no lights along the hull except the small running indicators near the docking ports. It was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to be effective, and looking at it, even in the cold blue light of a holographic projection, you could feel that effectiveness, like a pressure in the air. 4,012 crew, Grant said, built over 11 years at the Titan orbital yards. It carries more raw firepower than the combined fleets of the Velshari Concorde and the Dravith Assembly, which, as you probably know, are the two largest military powers in the Council alliance. I know, I said. The Council knows too, he said. That's the problem. He walked me through the rest of it in about 20 minutes. The political situation had been building for a long time, and I knew most of it already from my work in the liaison office. Humanity had been a junior member of the Galactic Council for 53 years. We had come in quietly, carefully, the way you come into a room where a formal meeting is already in progress. We had agreed to trade terms that were not entirely fair. We had agreed to territorial limits that left us with only 6 colonized systems, while species who had been in the Council longer had dozens. We had agreed to technology restrictions that slowed our development in areas the Council found threatening, specifically military technology, specifically propulsion, specifically weapons. For 50 years, we had agreed to almost everything. Not because we were weak, though many on the Council thought we were. Not because we were afraid, though we were sometimes that. but because the people who made these decisions believed, sincerely, that cooperation was worth the price of compromise, that the galaxy was safer when everyone was talking, that the door we opened by joining the council would eventually lead somewhere worth going. And then we built the Unbode, not as an act of defiance, not as a threat. We built it because 43 of our outer colonists on a deep-range station called Meridian Post had been lost in an incident that the Council classified as an unverified encounter with an unknown spatial phenomenon. We built it because we knew what that language meant when we read the sensor logs ourselves. We built it because 8 billion people looked at those logs and decided, quietly and collectively, that they did not want to be the species that kept showing up to a negotiating table without anything in their hands. The Council response was the 37-page compliance notice. And now Grant Daly was looking at me across a briefing room table, and I understood why I was here. "They're not going to fire on us," I said. "Not immediately. They'll want to negotiate first. It's what the Council does. They'll want to look reasonable." "Correct," Grant said. "But they'll have fleets there," I said, "to make a point." 17 confirmed, he said. "Possibly more. Intel is incomplete." I looked at the image of the Unbode again. "And we're sending one ship." "We're sending one ship," he said. I thought about that for a moment. One ship, one diplomat, 17 fleets, possibly more. 37 pages of legal language telling us to come apart and hand ourselves over in pieces. Who else knows about this? I asked. The Security Council, the Prime Minister, the heads of all 7 major space agencies. He paused. "And now, you. What am I supposed to say to them?" I asked. "When we get there, what is the actual message?" Grant looked at me for a long moment. He had the kind of eyes that did not move around when they were looking at you. They just settled and stayed. "The message," he said, "is that we came." I flew to the Titan yards the next morning, on a transport that smelled like recycled air and old coffee. I had one bag. I had my notes, my credentials, my language files, my recorder, and a photograph of the coastline where I grew up, that I kept folded in the front pocket of my jacket, because I found it helped to remember that the world existed in specific, particular ways, not just in abstract political terms. The Unbode was even larger up close. Standing on the access gantry looking at the hull, I felt the way I imagined people used to feel standing at the base of a very large mountain. Not small exactly, just accurately scaled. Captain Hira Singh met me at the docking port. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and gray threading through her dark hair, and she had the posture of someone who had spent years in environments where posture meant something for practical reasons. She shook my hand once, firmly. "Commander Dresch," she said. "Just Yael is fine," I said. She considered that for a moment. "All right," she said. "Just Yael. Welcome aboard. I'll show you to your quarters, and then I'd like you to come to the bridge, because we leave in 6 hours, and I want you to understand how this ship thinks, before we go anywhere." "How it thinks?" I said. "Every ship has a logic," she said, walking. "A way of moving through a problem. Ours is direct. I thought you should know that before we arrive." I followed her through corridors that were clean and functional, and lit in a steady, warm white that was nothing like the cold light of the briefing room in Geneva. People moved past us with purpose. A woman carrying a calibration tool nodded at the captain without breaking stride. 2 men arguing quietly about a pressure reading fell silent as we passed, then resumed the moment we were by them. There was a quality to the air aboard this ship, a kind of focused aliveness that I had not expected. 6 hours later, the Unbode detached from the Titan yards. I stood on the bridge and watched the solar system fall away behind us, and the stars ahead came up sharp and clear and absolutely countless, and I thought about the photograph in my jacket pocket, and the coastline, and the clouds that had always made the sky close. The stars looked nothing like I had imagined when I was a child. They looked better. They looked real and cold and genuinely far away, and I understood for the first time, standing on the bridge of a ship that could reach them, that the galaxy had no idea what it had just put in motion by sending that 37-page notice. 18 days. That was how long it would take to reach the conclave station. I had 18 days to figure out what to say. I did not waste a single one of them. I spent the first 3 days reading everything the diplomatic archive had on the Council's communication patterns, specifically the Velshari, who held the current rotating chair, and whose Grand Prefect would be the one delivering whatever ultimatum was waiting for us at the other end. The Velshari were an old species, over 4,000 years in spaceflight, and they communicated in a way that placed enormous importance on the first thing said in any formal exchange. Not the loudest thing, the first thing. They believed the opening statement revealed the true character of the speaker, and they shaped their entire response around it. I wrote 12 different opening statements. I threw away 11 of them. On the fourth day, I went down to the lower engineering sections because one of the crew, a young woman named Petra Marsh who was 22 years old, and the ship's junior warp calibration specialist, had sent me a message asking if I wanted to see something interesting. I went mostly because I needed to walk, and partly because in my experience, people who described things as interesting were usually right. Petra was standing next to a section of the warp manifold casing, with a look on her face that I would later come to recognize as her thinking face, which looked almost identical to her confused face, but with slightly less frowning. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a panel of readings. I looked. I understood approximately 1% of what I was looking at. "What am I seeing?" I asked. "Efficiency curve," she said. "We're running about 4% above the design spec. I've been trying to figure out why for 6 days, and I think it's because the resonance interaction between the third and fourth manifold rings is slightly different at this particular velocity than the engineers expected, which means we could theoretically push the speed up by about 8% without any additional stress on the hull." "That sounds good," I said. "It is good," she said. She paused. "Are you scared?" The question surprised me, not because it was inappropriate, but because no one else on the ship had asked it yet. Everyone else had been very professional and focused, and carefully not asking that particular question. "Yes," I said. "Me too," she said. "I keep thinking about the Council fleet numbers. 17 confirmed. That's a lot of ships." "It is," I said. She looked back at her panel. "But we're here, so we may as well be here properly." I thought about that sentence for the rest of the day. It was, I decided, the most honest summary of the human situation I had ever heard. We may as well be here properly. On day 9, Captain Singh called a full crew address. 4,012 people, either in person in the main assembly bay or watching on screens throughout the ship, listening to a woman who stood at the front of the room, with her hands behind her back, and her voice very steady. She did not give a speech about glory. She did not talk about history or destiny or the weight of what we were doing. She talked about the people on the Meridian post station. She said their names, all 43 of them, and she said that the ship was going to the conclave, not to start anything, but to make sure that what happened to those 43 people was never something the galaxy could classify as an unverified encounter with an unknown spatial phenomenon again. There was no applause when she finished. There was just silence, and then people went back to their stations. I stood in the back of the assembly bay for a while after everyone had gone, and I thought about the photograph in my jacket and the clouds, and the distance between then and now, and I wrote my 13th opening statement. It was 4 sentences long. It was the one I would use. On day 14, we picked up the first Council signal. It was a standard hailing frequency, but the content was not standard at all. It was a recorded message from Grand Prefect Uram of the Velshari, delivered in formal interstellar common, with the kind of precise diction that meant every word had been reviewed by a legal committee before transmission. The message informed us that the Galactic Council was prepared to receive our compliance declaration upon arrival, and that any deviation from the terms outlined in the original notice would result in immediate escalation. It used the word escalation 3 times in a message that was under 2 minutes long. I listened to it twice, then I turned off the recording and sat in my cabin for a while with the lights low. Escalation. They kept saying that word as though it were a warning, as though we had not already looked at 17 fleets and said, out loud, with an entire planet behind us, "We are coming anyway." On day 17, Petra knocked on my cabin door and handed me a printed readout and said the manifold efficiency had gone up another 0.5%, which she found interesting. "Are you still scared?" I asked. "No," she said. "Not anymore." "What changed?" I asked. She thought about it. "I think I just got tired of the fear," she said. "It takes up a lot of room." I slept well that night for the first time in 2 weeks. On the morning of day 18, I was standing at the observation window at the forward section of Deck 6 when the conclave station came into view. It was enormous. I had seen the dimensions in the briefings, but dimensions on paper and dimensions in front of your eyes are entirely different experiences. The station was a ring, roughly the diameter of a small moon, orbiting a gas giant that glowed amber and rust against the black. Around the ring, arranged in patterns that were either defensive or ceremonial, or both, were the council fleets. I counted 17. Then I counted again. I found a 47th formation I had not expected. Then I found a 48th. I stood at the window and breathed slowly, and counted again to make sure. Then I went to find Captain Singh. She was already on the bridge. She was looking at the same numbers on the tactical display, and her face was exactly as composed as it always was, which told me absolutely nothing about what she was thinking. 47 fleets, I said, coming to stand beside her. 47 confirmed, she said. Could be more behind the station. I looked at the display, at the rings of ships surrounding the conclave, at the station itself, enormous and calm, orbiting its amber planet. They're trying to make a point, I said. They are, she said. Is it working? She looked at me then, and there was something almost like humor in her expression, though humor was perhaps too light a word for what I saw. It was something more specific than that. It was the look of someone who has already done the calculation and arrived at their answer and is simply waiting for events to catch up with the math. What do you think? She said. I thought about 47 fleets. I thought about 37 pages of legal language. I thought about 43 names that a captain had read aloud in a room full of 4,000 people, and the silence that followed. Open a channel, I said. Let's find out. The hail came back inside 30 seconds. The response time alone told you something. 30 seconds meant they had been waiting. 30 seconds meant the channel was already staffed, and the recorders were already running, and every word I was about to say was going to be heard by every species in the Galactic Council simultaneously. Grand Prefect Uram appeared on the main screen. He was tall, in the way that Velshari were always tall, with the pale iridescent scaling along his jaw and throat that indicated age and rank among his people. He had 4 eyes, the outer 2 fixed and expressionless, the inner 2 mobile, and currently looking at me with an attention that felt like wait. He opened with the formal greeting of the council chair, which ran to about 45 seconds of ceremonial language that I knew well enough not to interrupt. Then he moved directly into the compliance request. His voice was careful. His phrasing was precise. He said, in the most civilized possible terms, that the UES Unbode was to stand down, prepare for boarding, and surrender its technical specifications to council custody. He finished. He waited. Every fleet in that system was waiting. 4,000 people on the ship behind me were waiting. I took a breath. I spoke my 4 sentences. Grand Prefect, I said, before we discuss compliance, I want to ask you a question. It is a personal question. I ask it not to be difficult, but because I believe the answer matters. I paused. Has the council ever lost someone it loved? The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. I know, because I counted. Then, Uram said, very quietly, why do you ask this? And I said, because we have. The channel stayed open. Nobody cut it. Nobody escalated. Nobody fired. That was how it started. The 11 seconds of silence after my question felt like standing at the edge of something very high, not because I expected the Grand Prefect to answer warmly, but because I knew, from 6 years of diplomatic study and everything I understood about the Velshari, that the one thing their entire communication culture could not process cleanly was an unexpected personal question, delivered without aggression. They were built for argument. They were built for procedure. They were built for the kind of formal back and forth that had governed interstellar politics for 4,000 years. What they were not built for was sincerity, delivered simply, without performance, without legal framing. Uram recovered quickly. He was a senior diplomat of an ancient species, and he had not reached his position by being easily thrown. He straightened, and his inner eyes refocused, and he said, in a voice that had gone slightly cooler. The Council does not consider personal sentiment relevant to matters of interstellar security. I know, I said. That's why I asked. Another silence. Shorter this time, but heavier. Commander Dresch, he said, because someone had sent him my credentials in the time it took him to respond. You are here as the representative of a species in non-compliance with a binding Council directive. I would advise you to focus on the terms of resolution, rather than on philosophical inquiry. Absolutely, I said, and I will. But I want to tell you something first, and I want to tell it to you honestly, without any diplomatic framing. He waited. His outer eyes did not move. His inner eyes, the ones that showed actual attention, were completely still. 43 people died at Meridian Post, I said. The Council classified their deaths as an unverified encounter with an unknown spatial phenomenon. We read the sensor logs. We know what that language means. We know what actually happened to them. I paused. We are not here to threaten the Council. We are not here because we want conflict. We are here because 43 people died, and no one in this system said their names, and we decided that was not acceptable. Uram was very still. Meridian Post was a classified incident, he said. Yes, I said. We noticed that too. The channel between us held. On the tactical display to my left, I could see the fleet positioning indicators updating in small increments, which meant the ships around the conclave were adjusting formation, not advancing, adjusting, which was interesting. You are aware, Uram said, after a pause that I thought was slightly longer than his previous ones, that the Council has 47 fleet formations currently active in this system. 47 confirmed, I said. Possibly more behind the station, we counted. Something moved in his expression. It was small and fast, and I was not entirely certain I had seen it correctly, but it looked like the very beginning of a reassessment. And yet you came, he said. Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact, as though he were noting something that did not fit any existing category. And yet we came, I said. He closed the channel. On the bridge, nobody spoke for about 10 seconds. Then the ship's tactical officer, a man named Colin Marsh who happened to be Petra's older brother, and who had the same quality of stillness she had, said quietly, Fleet formations are holding. No aggressive movement. Council communications are spiking internally. They're talking to each other. Good, Captain Singh said. Let them talk. What do you think they're saying? I asked. They're trying to figure out what we are, she said simply. She was looking at the station, not at me. They've read about us. They have our history, our biology, our political structure. They have data on our psychology. But data and encounter are different things. She glanced at me. You gave them something to encounter. I sat down in the observer's seat, near the communication console, and looked at my notes for a moment. They're going to ask why we brought the unbode, I said. That's going to be the central question once they get past the shock of us not immediately complying. What will you tell them? The truth, I said. The difficult version of it. The internal council communications ran for 40 minutes. During that time, the unbode held position at 8,000 kilometers from the station, which was well within range of every weapon system on both sides, and everyone on the bridge behaved as though this were a completely routine situation, which was either remarkable professionalism or remarkable denial, and I had long since decided it did not matter which. Petra's voice came over the internal channel from engineering. Manifold readings are stable, she said. We're good for anything up to combat speed if we need it. Thank you, Marsh, Captain Singh said. Any time, Petra said, and the channel closed. I thought about that. Any time. As though combat speed were a thing you offered someone the way you offered them coffee. There was a man on the bridge I had noticed on my first day, but had not yet spoken to directly. His name was Owen Blake, and he was the ship's senior communications analyst, which meant he spent his days inside the signals traffic of the galaxy, and had developed an ability to read what was happening in a room purely from the quality of sound coming out of it. He had been monitoring the council channels and making small notations on his display, and now he looked up and caught my eye. They're pulling in secondary delegates, he said. The Draveth Assembly and the Keth Confederacy are both being looped in. That's unusual for a first contact compliance situation. Those are the two species with the most military weight in the council after the Velshari. Why unusual? I asked. Because normally they just handle this at the chair level, he said. Bringing in the heavies means someone important got nervous. Good, I said again, before I could stop myself. Owen Blake looked at me with an expression that might have been respect, and might have been concern, and was possibly both. The channel reopened after 43 minutes. This time it was not just Uram. Behind him, visible in the frame, were two other figures. I recognized them both from their council profiles. The tall, angular form of High Marshal Dreveth of the Draveth Assembly, who was the closest thing the council had to a military supreme commander. And beside him, smaller, and wrapped in the layered fabric that Keth diplomats wore for formal sessions, was Senior Arbiter Voss of the Keth Confederacy, who was one of the most respected legal minds in the interstellar community, and who had been the architect of the trade compact that humanity had agreed to join 53 years ago. These were not junior officials. These were not the people you sent to process paperwork. These were the people you brought out when something had changed. Uram spoke first. Commander Dresch, the Council has reviewed your statement regarding Meridian Post. I am not in a position to confirm or deny the specifics of that classification at this time. I understand, I said. However, he continued, I am authorized to inform you that the Council is prepared to extend a 24-hour period of preliminary dialogue before any compliance action is required, conditional on the UES UNBOD maintaining its current position and making no aggressive maneuver. This was a significant concession, and everyone in the room knew it, including, I suspected, everyone watching the feed on the Council side. We accept those terms, I said. Good. He paused. I would also like to ask you something, Commander, in the spirit of the personal inquiry you opened our conversation with. I waited. When you left Earth, he said carefully, did you believe you would reach an agreement? I thought about that for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to give him the accurate one, rather than the diplomatic one. No, I said, I believed we would be here. That was enough. Dreveth, behind Uram, leaned forward slightly. His species communicated interest through posture rather than expression, and the angle of his lean was significant enough that Owen Blake, watching the feed, made a quiet note on his display. Explain that, Dreveth said. He had not been introduced, and had not asked permission to speak, which told me he did not feel he needed to, and that Uram had expected this, and was not surprised. Being here, I said, means something different from what you think it means. It does not mean we are not afraid. It does not mean we are certain we will succeed. Being here means we decided that the alternative, which was to not be here, was worse. I paused. 43 people at Meridian Post were not here because someone decided that the alternative was easier. We disagree with that decision, so we came. Voss of the Keth spoke for the first time. His voice was soft, almost conversational. You understand the position this puts the Council in? Yes, I said. You understand that the precedent of allowing a junior member species to bring a warship to the Conclave without consequence would have implications across the entire Council structure. Yes, I said. And you came anyway. We came anyway. There was a pause, and then Voss made a sound that his translator rendered as something between a sigh and a statement of finality. You are, he said, a remarkable amount of trouble for a species that has only been in space for 2 centuries. I thought about 8 billion people who had looked at a sensor log and decided that they were done being a quiet footnote to someone else's galaxy. We know, I said. The preliminary dialogue ran for 6 hours. I will not detail every exchange, because some of it was technical, and some of it was procedural, and some of it was the kind of formal back and forth that diplomacy always involves, and that is not interesting to anyone who was not there. What I will tell you is the shape of it, because the shape matters. In the first 2 hours, the Council tried to reframe the conversation as a compliance issue. They were very good at this. They had long experience in taking complex situations and feeding them through procedural channels until they came out the other side as simpler questions with predetermined answers. I had studied this pattern for years. I knew exactly what it looked like and exactly how to interrupt it without appearing to. which was the key skill of every successful diplomat I had ever respected. I interrupted it by not answering the procedural questions, not by refusing, which would have been aggressive, and given them something to react to, but by answering a different question instead, specifically the question underneath the one they were asking, the human question, the actual thing the situation was about. When they asked about the ship's weapons specification, I talked about the Meridian Post sensor logs. When they asked about our timeline for compliance, I asked what timeline they had used when deciding how to classify 43 deaths. When they asked about the legal framework of the trade compact, I asked about the framework for accountability. I was not trying to make them feel guilty. Guilt is not a useful diplomatic tool. I was trying to make the conversation real. I was trying to move it from the level of procedure to the level of actual things that had happened, to actual people, in actual space, because that was the only level on which the conversation had any chance of going anywhere worth going. By the third hour, Uram had stopped reading from prepared statements. By the fourth hour, Dravath was asking direct questions without legal framing. By the fourth hour, Voss said something that changed the temperature of the entire session. He said, "There is a species called the Yurak." The name landed in the conversation like something dropped from a height. I watched Uram's expression change, which was something I had not seen happen once in the previous 5 hours. I watched Dravath go very still. I watched Owen Blake, on the bridge, sit forward in his chair, and begin typing rapidly. "I know that name," I said. Voss looked at me with his quiet eyes. "Tell me what you know," he said. I told him, not everything, because I did not have everything, but what I had. The deep-range probe data that Earth's sensor network had been collecting quietly for the past decade, the pattern analysis, the trajectory modeling, the correlations between certain council-classified incidents, including Meridian Post, and a set of consistent signature readings that appeared in the sensor data from the edges of known space. Uram had gone very still. He was not looking at me. He was looking at something off-frame, which meant he was looking at something he had not expected to have to look at today. "How long have you known?" Dravath asked. His voice was flat, which in his species indicated something I had come to understand was not anger, but a careful, controlled version of alarm. "Earth's analysts have been tracking the signature pattern for about 8 years, I said. The formal assessment that it represented a coordinated intelligence rather than a natural phenomenon was concluded about 3 years ago. I paused. "We named them. In our records." "What did you call them?" Voss asked. "The Yurak," I said. "We found the name in a fragmentary historical record from the Keth Confederacy's pre-council period. It seemed appropriate." Voss made the sound again, the one between a sigh and a statement of finality, but this time it was larger. "What we are about to tell you," he said, "does not leave this session." "I cannot agree to that," I said immediately, "not without knowing what it is." Another silence, longer than the others. Uram finally looked back at the camera. "The Yurak," he said quietly, "have been moving toward the inner systems for 300 years. I kept my face still. On the bridge behind me, I could feel the quality of the room change. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a certain kind of stillness that settles over people when they understand that the thing they were told was a warning sign was actually already in motion. "We know," I said. And this time, I watched 3 of the most powerful diplomatic figures in the Galactic Council realize that a species they had considered a junior member, a quiet nuisance, a compliance problem, had been doing its homework. "You brought the unbode," Dravath said slowly, as though he were thinking through the logic of it for the first time out loud. "Not because you wanted to threaten the council." "No," I said. "You brought it because you expected to need it." "Yes," I said. "For the Yurak." "Yes," I said. The channel was very quiet. "We have been managing the Yurak situation," Uram said carefully, "for 3 centuries. The strategy has involved maintaining a series of buffer positions along the outer edge of council space." "I know," I said. "We found the buffer positions. We found what they were protecting. We also found Meridian Post on that list." The silence that followed that sentence was the longest yet. 17 seconds. I counted every one. Uram finally said, in a voice that had changed in a way I could hear but not easily describe, The buffer strategy has preserved the inner council systems for 300 years. Yes, I said. And it cost 43 people their lives without telling them, or anyone on Earth, what they were actually facing. I let that sit for a moment. We are not here to punish the council for those choices. We are here because we have the unbowed, and we have the data, and we have 4,000 people who knew exactly what they might be sailing into when they agreed to make this trip, and that changes the situation. Voss looked at me for a long time. You are proposing something, he said. Yes, I said. What? I'm proposing that the council stops treating the Urak like a problem that can be managed with buffer positions and classified incidents, I said. I'm proposing that we stop making quiet sacrifices of outer colonies and outer stations and outer people, and start treating this as what it actually is, which is the largest threat to every species in this system, council members and humans alike. And the unbowed? Dravath said. Stays, I said. And if you'll let us, we'll help you figure out what to do about what's coming. Another silence. But this one was different. This one did not feel like hesitation. This one felt like a room full of very old, very powerful people, trying to figure out how to say yes. I did not have long to wait for an answer. Before the council delegates could complete their internal deliberation, before Uram could formulate the careful diplomatic response that would acknowledge the shift in the conversation without formally committing to anything, Owen Blake's voice cut across the bridge with a precision that turned every head. Contact, he said. 12 signatures. Edge of sensor range. Coming from the dark side of the gas giant. Nobody moved for exactly 1 second. Then Captain Singh said, battle stations, and the ship changed. The change was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no alarms blaring or lights flashing red, because the unbowed's design philosophy was that unnecessary sensory overload during a crisis reduced efficiency, and efficiency was what mattered. What happened instead was a kind of organized acceleration that ran through the whole ship like a current, 4,000 people moving to their positions with the certainty of people who had practiced this particular sequence of motions enough times that the practice had become reflex. I stayed at the communication console. I was not going to be useful anywhere else, and being useful was the only thing I had to offer. On the main screen, Uram's expression had shifted. The careful diplomatic composure was still there, but underneath it something else had appeared. I had studied enough alien physiology to know what I was looking at. The slight contraction around his outer eyes, the way his scaling seemed to pale fractionally along the jaw. I had read about these signs in the Velshari documentation. It was fear. Grand Prefect, I said quietly, how long has it been since the Urak sent an active probe this close to the conclave? They have never, he said, and stopped. Never, I said. He said nothing. Owen, I said, are those signatures consistent with the pattern we have in the database? Owen Blake was working fast, 2 screens running simultaneously, pulling the deep-range probe data that Earth's analysts had spent 8 years assembling, and running it against the incoming signatures in real time. Consistent, he said. Actually better than consistent. This is a textbook match to the Vanguard formation pattern in the trajectory models. 12 ships is exactly the size the models predicted for a first active probe. They were attracted by the energy output, Colin Marsh said from the tactical station. 47 fleets gathering in one system produces a significant signature. It would be detectable from well outside normal sensor range. I turned back to the main screen. Grand Prefect, High Marshal, Arbiter. I looked at each of them in turn. What is the Council's protocol for a Urak active contact? Dravath answered, because Uram appeared to be having difficulty forming words. Emergency dispersal. All fleet assets move to minimum tactical spacing to reduce target density. The conclave station activates its deep shielding. And then? I said. Dravath looked at me. His expression was the controlled alarm expression. And then we wait for them to assess and withdraw. Has that always worked? I said. A pause. In the past, he said. In the past, I repeated. When the Urak have encountered a single council presence, or a small fleet. I looked at the tactical display, where 12 incoming signatures were now close enough to show directional movement. They have never encountered the kind of energy signature that 47 fleets produce, and they have certainly never encountered something that looks like what the unbowed looks like on a sensor reading. Dravath went very still. What does the unbode look like on a sensor reading? Owen Blake, without being asked, put the answer on the screen. It was a comparative display. The unbode sensor profile next to the profile of the largest Velshari flagship in the assembled fleets. The Velshari flagship was substantial. By any reasonable measure, it was an impressive vessel. The unbode's profile was approximately 3 times its size in every relevant dimension, and showed an energy signature that the display helpfully highlighted in a separate color because it exceeded the scale of the original chart. Dravath looked at the display for several seconds. "Oh," he said. And then, precisely as Earth's trajectory models had predicted, and precisely as I had feared and prepared for, the Council fleets began to move. Not toward the 12 incoming signatures, away from them. The dispersal protocol was activating, but what emergency dispersal looked like in practice, with 47 fleets all simultaneously trying to move away from a perceived threat, was not organized or disciplined. It was chaotic. It was 47 separate fleet commanders following the same instruction at the same time without coordination, and the result was traffic that would have been almost funny in different circumstances. On the main screen, Uram's feed flickered as his own flagship began its dispersal maneuver. "Commander Dresch," he said, and his voice had lost about 20 years of careful diplomatic composure. "I strongly recommend that the unbode also." "We're not going anywhere," I said. He stared at me. "The protocol." "With respect," I said. "The protocol was written before the Urak encountered something that looks like us on a sensor reading. I think the situation has changed." The feed from his channel shifted as his ship continued its dispersal movement, carrying him away from the immediate area. Behind him, Dravath's image was already resolving into static, as the Dravath flagship followed suit. Only Voss remained on a stable channel, his ship apparently not yet following the dispersal order, his expression attentive in the quiet, careful way that had characterized him throughout our exchange. "Commander Dresch," Voss said, "what are you planning to do?" I looked at Captain Singh. She was looking at the tactical display, and her expression was the same as it always was, that composed, mathematically settled look, but her eyes were moving across the data with a speed that told me she had already done most of the calculation, and was simply confirming the last few variables. She looked at me. "There are non-combatant vessels in the area around the Conclave station," she said. "Research ships, diplomatic transports, civilian traffic that was orbiting the station before this started. If the 12 incoming Urak craft push through the dispersal gap that 47 fleets all moving at once just created, those ships are directly in the path." "How many?" I asked. Colin Marsh checked his display. "At least 60 civilian vessels confirmed. Probably more that aren't broadcasting full identification." I thought about Meridian Post. I thought about 43 people, and the word unverified, and the language that made real things disappear into categories. I thought about what it meant to be the species that watched something happen, and said we were there but there was nothing we could do. I turned back to Voss's channel. "We're going to move the unbode between the incoming signatures and the Conclave station," I said. "Not to engage. To position." "That is," Voss said carefully, "a significant decision." "Yes," I said. "It may be interpreted as aggression by the incoming craft." "It may be," I said. "It may also be interpreted as the clearest possible statement about whose space they're entering." There was a pause. "You understand what you're putting this crew through?" I understood exactly what I was putting them through. "I do," I said. Captain Singh had already given the order. The unbode was moving. The thing about a ship that size moving at combat speed is that it is not quiet, and it is not graceful, and it is nothing like the images in the science documentaries they used to make before humanity actually got into deep space. It is a physical experience. The deck moved differently. The ambient noise of the ship changed register. It was not unpleasant exactly, but it was unmistakable, and I felt it in my back teeth. Owen Blake was tracking the incoming signatures and the fleet dispersal simultaneously, and the picture he was assembling on his display was not reassuring. The 12 Urak craft were continuing on their approach vector. The dispersal of 47 Council fleets had, exactly as predicted, created a gap in coverage around the Conclave station's eastern approach that was now essentially open, and the Urak approach vector was pointing directly at it. "They're not going to stop," Colin said. "Their formation hasn't changed. If they were responding to the dispersal as a deterrent, We'd see course adjustment. There isn't any. Because they've seen this before, I said. They've been watching the Council run this pattern for 300 years. They know what dispersal looks like. They know what it means. What does it mean to them? Owen asked. That the path is clear, I said. The unbowed crossed the open gap and took up its position. On every sensor in the system, on every fleet display and every Council ship currently engaged in dispersal, and on every tracking system, the 12 incoming Urak craft possessed, a single object had just appeared between them and the Conclave station. Not a fleet, not a formation, one ship. One ship with an energy profile that nothing in the Urak's encounter history had ever matched. The 12 incoming signatures slowed. It was a small change, barely perceptible at first, but Colin Marsh caught it immediately. Speed reduction, he said. 20% across all 12 signatures. They're still inbound, but they're decelerating. They're reading us, Owen said. Let them read, Captain Singh said. What followed next was the longest 40 minutes of my life. Not because of action, because of the absence of it, because we held our position and the 12 Urak craft held theirs, and the entire system seemed to hold its breath, and nobody did anything, and the weight of that nothing was almost physical. Petra's voice came through the internal channel. She was running updates every few minutes from engineering, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had decided it helped to know the numbers were stable. Each time she called in, her voice was steady and factual, and entirely without drama, and it was the most reassuring thing I heard during those 40 minutes. On the 6th update, she said, "Still good down here. Manifold is performing perfectly. We could hold this position for another 8 hours minimum without any issue." "Good," Captain Singh said. "Also," Petra said, "we counted the stars from the observation port down here. And it helps to look at them." "How many?" Owen asked. "Enough," Petra said. I looked at my recorder, where I had been noting everything that was happening for the diplomatic record. I had a great deal of detail, sensor readings, timestamp data, communications transcripts. What I did not have, and what I was certain no report would ever fully capture, was the quality of the quiet on that bridge during those 40 minutes. The way 4,000 people went about the specific work of their stations while being, simultaneously, completely aware that 12 ships of an unknown but categorically dangerous species were sitting on the other side of a gap in the dark and deciding what to do about the one object between them and what they had been moving toward. The decision the Urak made was to stop, not permanently. Voss, back on the channel at his calm frequency, was careful to explain later that this was assessed as a tactical reassessment rather than a withdrawal. They had encountered something they had no category for, and their pattern, as Earth's models had predicted, was not aggression against unknown variables. It was evaluation. They would go back, they would analyze, they would return. But not today. The 12 signatures reversed course over a period of about 20 minutes, slowly, without drama, and moved back into the dark from which they had come. Colin Marsh watched them go off his screen one by one, and when the last one cleared the sensor range, he made a small mark on his display and said nothing. His eyes were very bright. Owen Blake let out a slow breath. I had not heard him breathe particularly loudly before that, but the exhale told me something about the previous 40 minutes that all the sensor data in the universe could not. Captain Singh looked at the now empty space on the tactical display for a long moment. "All hands," she said over the ship channel. "Status report." The reports came in from every section. They took about 4 minutes. Every one of them was fine. When the last report came in, from a junior engineer in the lower decks whose voice was noticeably younger than everyone else's but just as steady, Singh closed the channel and stood quietly for a moment. Then she looked at me. "Voss is back on channel," Owen said. "Put him through," I said. Voss appeared on the main screen. He was in what appeared to be a smaller room than before, private, without the other delegates visible. His expression was the careful, quiet one. "The Urak have withdrawn," he said. "Yes," I said. "The Council fleets are returning to formation." He paused. "It will take some time." "I imagine it will," I said. "Commander Dresch." He stopped. There was something in the way he stopped that I had not heard from him before. A kind of weight entering the pause that had not been there in the first 6 hours. "What you did today," he said slowly, "by remaining in position and presenting the unbowed in the path of the vanguard, was not in any diplomatic protocol I have encountered. No, I said. It was not requested by the council. No, I said. It was not part of any agreement. No, I said. Why did you do it? I thought about Meridian Post. I thought about 43 names read aloud in a room where 4,000 people went quiet. I thought about Petra counting stars from an observation port because it helped to look at them. I thought about the photograph in my jacket pocket, the coastline, the clouds that had always made the sky close. Because the civilian ships were in the path, I said, and we were here. Voss was quiet for a moment. There were 63 civilian vessels confirmed, he said. The count was updated during the event. 63, I said. Yes. Another pause. Species from 7 different council member worlds, including 2 Velshari research vessels. I thought about Uram, about the fear I had seen in his expression before his flagship moved away, about the 300 years of managing the Iraq situation with buffer zones and classified incidents, and the very careful, very practiced diplomatic language of not quite saying what was actually happening. Is Uram available? I asked. Voss considered that. He can be, he said. I don't want an apology, I said. I'm not interested in that. I want to talk about what comes next. Voss nodded. Very slightly. I'll arrange it. The channel closed. Owen Blake turned from his console and looked at me with an expression that I realized I had been seeing on faces around the bridge for the past several minutes, without fully registering it. It was the same thing I had seen on Colin Marsh's face when the last Iraq signature left the sensor range. The same thing I had heard in the junior engineer's steady voice on the status report. Not relief, exactly. Something more like resolution. The feeling of having done the specific thing you came to do. I sat down. My legs had been fine during the entire event. They seemed to have saved their objection for afterward. Petra's voice came through on the internal channel one more time. Engineering status. All clear, she said. Also, a pause. I want everyone to know that I have just drafted a formal request to be assigned to whatever comes next. That's all. Someone on the bridge laughed. It was a small sound, brief, but real. I put my hands flat on the console and breathed. Outside, through the forward viewport, the gas giant glowed amber and rust, and around it, the council fleets were slowly, carefully reforming, and the conclave station turned in its ancient orbit, and 63 ships that had been in the direct path of something that had been moving toward the inner systems for 300 years were still there, still whole. The unboat held its position and waited. That was all, and it was enough. The conversation that happened next took 3 days. Not because the issues were complicated, though they were. Not because the emotions were difficult, though they were that too. It took 3 days, because real things that have been avoided for 3 centuries do not resolve in an afternoon, and because I had been a diplomat long enough to know that trying to rush an agreement that matters is the surest way to produce an agreement that does not last. Uram came back to the channel on the morning of the first day, and the conversation he opened with was different from the one we had started with. He was still formal, he was still careful, but the quality of his caution had changed. Before the Iraq Vanguard appeared, his caution had been the caution of someone managing a compliance situation, containing something inconvenient. Now it was the caution of someone trying to say something difficult correctly. The council acknowledges, he said, and stopped. Started again. The situation at Meridian Post was classified at the recommendation of the Iraq Management Directorate. It was not a decision I was personally involved in, but I was aware of it. I said nothing. I let him continue. The Directorate's position was that public acknowledgement of Iraq activity in that region would cause significant alarm across council member species, and potentially destabilize trade compacts and cooperative agreements that the inner systems depend on. He paused. The logic was sound, from a certain perspective. And from other perspectives, I said. 43 people died without their species being told why, he said. And their species built a warship and came here anyway. Which suggests that the policy of managed silence did not ultimately preserve the stability it was intended to protect. No, I said. It did not. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want from this conversation, Commander Dresch? The truth, I said. All of it. Everything the Directorate has on the Iraq. Movement patterns, encounter history, incident logs, The buffer zone maps, all of it, shared openly with Earth's government and also with the General Council membership, not just the senior delegates. That will cause significant alarm, he said. It will cause honesty, I said, which might feel like alarm at first. Another pause. And in return? We stay, I said. The unbowed stays. Earth will contribute to a coordinated response to what is coming, rather than being managed around it. I paused. And no more buffer zones. No more outer colonies used as quiet protection for inner systems without their knowledge or consent. Ram was still. That second condition will require significant structural changes to council policy. Yes, I said. It will. Why does it matter to you? He said. If the buffer strategy has functioned to reduce casualties overall. It matters, I said, because the people in those outer positions are people, not positions, not buffer material, not an acceptable expenditure in a management strategy. I looked at him. We know what it is to be treated as expendable. We have been treated that way for 53 years. We do not find it acceptable in general. Dreveth, who had joined the channel on the second day with considerably less of his initial alarm, and considerably more of his actual analytical capacity, added something that I had not expected him to add. He said, "There is a practical argument as well. The buffer strategy has been degrading for approximately 40 years. The Yirak are moving through positions faster than new ones can be established. The system is failing regardless of whether humanity objects to it on ethical grounds." I looked at him. You've known this. Elements of the council military leadership have known this, he said. It has been difficult to communicate upward. Why? I said. He looked at me steadily. Because acknowledging that the strategy is failing requires acknowledging that the strategy was always a delay tactic rather than a solution. And that is a very large thing for an institution that has been in existence for 4,000 years to acknowledge. I thought about that. 4,000 years, the weight of it. The accumulated logic of decisions made so long ago that the reasons for them had become invisible, and only the decisions themselves remained. We have a saying, I said, on Earth. It goes, the best time to change a wrong approach was yesterday. The second best time is now. Dreveth made a sound that his translator rendered as a thoughtful noise. Simple, he said. Most useful things are, I said. Voss, on the third day, brought something different to the conversation. He brought the Yirak archive. It was not everything, he said, because some of the oldest records were in languages that had been imperfectly translated, and some of them were in formats that had not been fully decoded. But what he brought was substantial. I sat with it in my cabin for 6 hours. Captain Singh came and sat with me for 2 of those hours, not talking, just reading alongside me. At one point she stopped at a particular section and looked up. They're not what the council thinks they are, she said. No, I agreed. They're not irrational. They're not purely aggressive. They're adaptive. They probe, they assess, they withdraw when the calculation doesn't favor advance. Yes, I said. Which means, she said slowly, that yesterday, they learned something. They learned what we look like, I said, and that we don't run. She looked at the archive data. That changes their calculation. It does, I said. It means we have time, not unlimited time, not comfort, but time to actually prepare something real, instead of managing the problem quarter century by quarter century, with buffer zones and silence. She sat back. That's something. It is, I said. She looked at me for a moment. You look tired, she said. I have not slept significantly in several days, I said. Go to sleep after this session, she said. That is not a suggestion. Understood, I said. I did not go to sleep after the session. I stayed up for 2 more hours, writing. Not a diplomatic report, a letter, to the 43 families. Not one letter for all of them. 43 individual letters, each one different, because I had read enough of the Meridian Post personnel files in the archive to know something specific about each person who had been there. A woman named Claire Abbott, who had been a geologist, and had published 3 papers on mineral formation in low-gravity environments. A man named Patrick Foley, who had been the station's communications lead, and who had spent 6 years learning 3 alien languages in his spare time, because he thought it might be useful someday. A young man named Danny Sears, who had been 26 years old, and had been on his first deep space posting, and whose personnel file noted that he was an excellent cook, and that the station had regarded this as a significant morale asset. I wrote 43 letters. I said their names. I said what happened, and why it was not called what it was, and I said that we went anyway, and I said that we were here. Then I went to sleep. On the morning of the 4th day after the Yihrak Vanguard appeared, the Council completed its formal response. It was not everything I had asked for. Diplomatic agreements never are, because the distance between what is right and what is achievable is always present, and always has to be navigated with some patience and some compromise. What it was substantial. The Yihrak Management Directorate was to be formally dissolved and its archive transferred to a new joint body that would include Earth's representatives, alongside senior council members from 12 species. The buffer zone policy was suspended pending review, with an immediate commitment to notify all outer colony stations of their classified risk designation. The Meridian Post incident was to be formally reclassified in the public record, and the unbode was formally recognized as a lawful presence in council space, not as a threat, not as a compliance problem, but as what it was. Uram delivered the formal statement himself. His voice was careful and precise, as it always was, but at the end of it, he stepped slightly off script, which I had not expected, and which told me something important. He said, "The Council extends its formal acknowledgement to the crew of the UES Unbode for their actions during the Yihrak contact event of this session." The protection rendered to 63 civilian vessels was not requested, was not part of any agreement, and was given without condition. He stopped. Then he said, very precisely, "The Council thanks you." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "We did not do it for thanks." "I know," he said. "That is why it was worth saying." The return journey took 18 days, the same as the outward trip, but it did not feel the same. Nothing was different about the ship. Nothing was different about the stars, but the quality of the 18 days was entirely unlike the quality of the first 18, and I found it difficult to explain, then and later, exactly how. On the first day of the return, I went down to engineering to see Petra. She was at the manifold panel, as she usually was, and she was making a small notation in her monitoring log, with the focused attention she gave to everything. "Efficiency is still up," she said, without turning around, because she had heard my footsteps. "Good," I said. "Heading home," she said. "Heading home," I agreed. She turned around. She looked at me for a moment. She looked, I thought, slightly older than she had on the outbound trip, which was not a description of her face, but of something else, something that had settled into her, that had not been there before. "The letters you wrote," she said. "The 43. My brother told me." "Yes," I said. "Were they hard to write?" "Yes," I said. She nodded. "Good," she said quietly. "They should be." I went back to my cabin and looked at the photograph of the coastline for a while. The clouds in the picture were thick and low, and doing what clouds over that coast always did, covering most of the sky. But at the edge of the photograph, just at the horizon, there was a gap, a narrow strip of clear blue between the cloud and the sea, where the light came through. I had never particularly noticed that strip before. I noticed it now. On day 9 of the return, Owen Blake came to find me during my off hours. He had a look on his face that I had come to recognize as his "I have been thinking" expression, which was similar to his working expression, but with more of the weight showing. "I've been running the Yihrak archive data against our probe records," he said. "And? There's a pattern in the withdrawal behavior that the Council's models don't account for," he said. "Every time the Yihrak have encountered something they didn't expect, their reassessment period follows the same curve. It's about 4 to 6 years between first unexpected encounter and their next significant approach to the same area." I looked at him. 4 to 6 years. To plan, to regroup, to decide what they're going to do differently, he said. Based on the archive data, when they come back after a reassessment, they come back differently. They adapt. "How much time do we have?" I said. "If the pattern holds," he said, "and if what happened here reset their assessment timer, which I believe it did, somewhere between 4 and 6 years. 4 years. I sat with that number for a while. Not a panic. Not a deadline. A window. Put that in the Joint Archive report, I said. Full analysis. Include the methodology so the Council's analysts can review it independently. Already drafted, he said. He paused. It's going to require a significant cooperative response. Not just one ship. Not even a dozen ships. I know, I said. Are we going to get that? I thought about Uram stepping off script. About Drevith saying the buffer strategy was failing 40 years ago, and finding it difficult to communicate upward. About Voss, who had been quiet and careful for 3 days, and had brought the archive and said, "This is everything I have to give you." I think so, I said. Not easily. Not quickly enough. But yes. He nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. Yael. Yes. Yesterday was my son's 3rd birthday, he said. He's home with his mother. I was thinking about him during the event. I know, I said. I could tell. He looked slightly surprised. How? You breathe differently when you're thinking about someone you love, I said. Almost everyone does. He was quiet for a moment. Does that help? In your work? Reading those kinds of things? More than almost anything else, I said. He nodded again and left, and I sat alone in my cabin and looked at the photograph and thought about a 3-year-old child celebrating a birthday on a planet that was alive and whole and lit by a sun that had not been interfered with, and I thought about the 63 ships that were still whole, and the 43 names, and the window of 4 to 6 years, and what it meant to have time to do something with. On the last day, I went up to the observation deck on the forward section and watched the solar system come into view. It came in slowly at first, just a brightening in one part of the dark, and then more quickly as we decelerated, and then suddenly there it was, the sun, enormous and familiar, and the specific shade of yellow-white that you only see from close by, and that people who grow up under a different star always find remarkable when they first see it. Captain Singh found me there about an hour later. She stood beside me at the observation window for a while without speaking. The Council will want a formal follow-up session within 60 days, she said eventually. I know. The new Joint Archive body will need staffing. I know. Owen's analysis needs to go to the Prime Minister's office before anything else. It does. I'll handle that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about that honestly, like something finished, I said, and like something started. She considered that. That seems right, she said. We stood there for a while longer, watching the solar system come in. Earth was not visible yet, just a point, barely distinguishable from the stars around it. But you knew where to look, and if you knew where to look, you could see it. Colin Marsh came up to the observation deck about 20 minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee that he had apparently decided the situation required. He handed one to the captain and one to me and stood beside us, and we were quiet for a while. Then Petra came up, because the engineering section apparently had very little to monitor during a standard deceleration, and she had decided she would rather be somewhere with a window. She stood on the other side of the captain and looked at the solar system coming in. "Is that home?" she asked, pointing. "That's home," Colin said. She looked at it for a while. "It looks small from here," she said. "It is," I said. "And it isn't." She nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "That's about right." More people drifted up to the observation deck over the next hour. Not all 4,000 of them, but enough that the space was full and warm, and there was the particular kind of quiet that happens when a lot of people are all looking at the same thing, and all of them understand, in their different ways and from their different starting points, what it means. I stood with my coffee and my photograph in my jacket pocket and watched the point of light that was Earth grow slowly larger, and I thought about what I would say when I got there, about what had happened and what it meant and what came next. I had a great deal to say and a significant amount of reporting to do, and a number of conversations that would be long and complicated and necessary. But standing there, watching it come in, what I mostly thought about was something Petra had said on the outbound trip. 11 words that had seemed simple at the time and that I had been turning over ever since. We may as well be here properly. 8 billion people on a pale point of light, at the edge of a galaxy that had not fully decided what it thought of them yet. A species that had been quiet and careful and accommodating for 53 years, and had then looked at a sensor log and built a ship and said, without drama and without apology, We are going to be here, and we are going to be here properly. The Galactic Council had retreated when our warship appeared, not because we threatened them, not because we were the most powerful thing in the system, but because we were the one thing in that system that had looked at everything waiting for us there. The fleets, the compliance orders, the Yirok at the edge of the dark, and had not turned around. That was what we were. Not warriors, not conquerors, not the apex predators the Council had always feared we might be. Something else. Something that, standing at the observation window watching Earth come in, I found genuinely difficult to name in any language I knew. I tried to write it down in my recorder. I got about 2 sentences in, and stopped. Some things are better understood than explained. The U-boat crossed into Earth orbit at 11:47 hours, standard time. Approach control hailed us with the standard docking protocol, and Captain Singh responded with the standard acknowledgement, and the whole vast machinery of return began to run in its ordinary and necessary way. I stayed at the window until Earth filled it entirely. Blue and white and the particular green of landmass seen from orbit. Clouds over the coast where I grew up, as always. Thick and low, covering most of the sky. But at the edges, as always, there was light. I put the photograph back in my jacket pocket. We had work to do.